And thank you so much for joining us at Secular AZ today. And again, please let us know where you're from and put your name in the chat. For those of you who are joining us on the webinar, you already know this, that white Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to our democracy. But if you're new, that is what's happening right now. And we, Secular AZ, are your voice for the separation of religion and government. We are a nonprofit and we act as your voice to elected officials all across the state and at every level, from school board all the way up to the legislature, and occasionally we might even, be paying attention to what's happening at the county and the state levels. So we do have great programming, including our Friday updates that come from all kinds of amazing speakers. We have historians, authors, elected officials, journalists, etc. Next Friday, we will be speaking with special guest Rick Pidcock, who will speak on concerning treads toward authoritarian Christianity. That's right. These folks seem to want to turn us into a theocracy, and I am over it, including Arizona's 10 Commandments in Schools bill. So you want to be here next Friday to talk about that, because as you all know, there is a bill moving through our state legislature that would allow for the posting of the 10 Commandments. Also, our legal team is really overwhelmed right now. They have 25-ish complaints this year already, and normally we have 25 for the entire year. So if you or somebody has some legal prowess and wants to join the legal committee, by all means, or if you maybe even know a law student who would like to intern, we've got places for them. But today, I'm really excited. And I know a lot of my friends have been looking forward to this discussion today, because today we'll be speaking with Kimberly Mutcherson. She is a professor of law and former co-dean at Rutgers Law School in Camden. Professor Mutcherson is a reproductive justice scholar whose work focuses on assisted reproduction and abortion, among other topics. Cambridge University Press released her edited volume, Feminist Judgments, Reproductive Justice Rewritten, in 2020. In 2023, Professor Mutcherson received the Trailblazer Award from the New Jersey Human Lawyers Association. Women Lawyers Association. My apologies. She is also a human, just so you know. She was the co-recipient of the 2021 M. Shanara Gilbert Human Rights Award from the Society of American Law Teachers and the 2020 Association of American Law Schools inaugural Impact Award as one of the creators of the Law Dean's Antiracist Clearinghouse project. She's also served as a scholar in residence at the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Center at NYU Law School, a senior fellow sabbatical visitor at the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law at Columbia Law School, and a visiting scholar at the Center for Bioethics at the University of Pennsylvania. Somebody needs to insert that clip of Wayne's World where they're saying we're not worthy. Prior to entering academia, Professor Mutcherson was a consulting attorney at the Center for Reproductive Rights and a Kirkland and Ellis Fellow and staff attorney at the HIV Law Project. Whew! She received her BA from the University of Pennsylvania and her JD from Columbia Law School. Wow! This is incredible. So great to have you on our program. And honestly, I am just going to go ahead and let you take the reins here and inundate us with all the terrible news you have.
I feel like that's all I do these days, tell everybody about the coming disaster and the existing disaster. So first of all, thank you all so much for having me here. It is a pleasure. This is not one of my usual audiences, so it's always fun for me to talk to new groups of people. So I very much appreciate the invitation to be here. So here's what I'm going to try to do in the time that we have together. I'm going to talk for about 30 to 35 minutes. I'm from the Northeast, so you will find that I start to talk faster and faster as we get into this. And then happy to have as much conversation as possible when I'm all done. I am going to strive to be efficient with my time, so I may be sort of skipping over some things and not being super comprehensive on some of the issues. So during the Q&A, I am more than happy to expand on anything that I say. So here's what I am going to cover in the time that we have together. First, I want to talk about the concept of reproductive justice because all of my work is steeped in reproductive justice, and people often conflate reproductive justice and reproductive rights. I want to be really clear about what I'm talking about there. I want to give you an understanding of the historical landscape of law and ethics and procreation in this country, and then talk about current and future challenges of our post-Roe Dobbs era that we have entered. So that's a lot, but I promise I'll do it pretty efficiently. So let me start out with reproductive justice. So reproductive justice is actually a movement that was started by Black women in the mid-90s. These were folks who had been doing enormous amounts of work in their communities across a whole host of different issues, including issues related to reproductive rights. And they found themselves getting really frustrated with mainstream reproductive rights organizations, which were often led by white women and often middle and upper class white women, whose issues were not necessarily the same as people in communities of color and low income folks, folks in the South, et cetera. And because that movement was so hyper focused on questions of choice and on abortion, they weren't really focused on some of the other issues that were very salient in the lives of Black women and other women of color. So reproductive justice was created as a sort of way to expand the movement. And so it, of course, includes reproductive rights, but it also is much broader. So here are the central tenets of reproductive justice. First, that everyone has a human right to decide if and when she'll have a baby, the conditions under which she will give birth. Second tenet is to decide if she won't have a baby and options for preventing or ending a pregnancy. And the third tenet is really one of my favorites. I like them all, but the third is really one of my favorites: to parent the children she already has with the necessary social supports in safe environments and healthy communities, and without fear of violence from individuals or from the government. So RJ is human rights based, so it's not just concerned with, where do you live and what does the Constitution say where you happen to live. It is centered on the idea that there are certain rights that we all have access to simply by virtue of being human beings. It is intersectional in the very true sense of that word, meaning that it begins by acknowledging that overlapping marginalized identities, such as being Black and a woman, can create unique forms of discrimination and oppression. It is fundamentally rooted in the experiences of women of color, and it recognizes that marginalized communities often experience reproductive oppression in ways that are very different from folks who are from majority communities. So RJ is really expansive in ways that, frankly, typical reproductive rights discourse is not, and really has never been. And that's part of why it is such a powerful tool for talking about the issues we're going to talk about today. It's not simply concerned with pregnancies, but with how those pregnancies come to be, how those pregnancies end if someone chooses to end them, how a person gives birth, right? The whole concept of obstetric violence is a part of reproductive justice, and the spaces and supports that are available for raising children once you have given birth to them. So RJ issues really cross the board, and it's a really great way to engage in coalition work. So issues that are RJ issues: environmental justice, right? If you have children and you cannot raise them in safe communities and there's lead paint in your walls and you're covered with toxins, then that's a problem, right? And that's not justice. Criminal justice reform is a reproductive justice issue. Access to high quality and affordable childcare is a reproductive justice issue. Having strong public schools for everyone is a reproductive justice issue. Ending racial disparities in health and in access to healthcare, an RJ issue. Income inequality, that is a reproductive justice issue. The overrepresentation of children of color in our child welfare system, also called by some folks the family policing system, that is an RJ issue. And homelessness and housing insecurity, all of those issues are reproductive justice issues. So I could go on, but I feel like you're a group of smart people, and so you get what I'm saying when I talk about reproductive justice and how expansive it is. So what an RJ frame does is it really helps us understand that abortion is part of a web of decisions that people might have to make about pregnancy, and that those decisions are tied to a whole host of other considerations about a pregnant person's life. The lesson is that we should be cautious about talking about abortion in isolation without considering the larger reality of a pregnant person's life and the circumstances in which that person is living. So an RJ frame requires that we think of issues within a historical context, in part to remind us of what's possible when people, and by people, I mean the people who make our laws and policies, overstep the bounds of their professional and policymaking roles. So that larger historical context, which is always a part of how I think about all these issues in the context of reproductive health care and reproductive rights and reproductive justice, really steeps itself in a whole host of historical realities that unfortunately we don't necessarily talk about as much anymore, or frankly teach about very much anymore. So when I teach these things in some of my classes, I'm always sort of taken aback by how many students say, I had never heard of that before. So things like Native American boarding schools, where Indigenous children were taken from their homes and placed into boarding schools so that they could be civilized. Eugenic sterilization laws, which people like to think of as this thing that happened in the South, and yet at various points, most states in this country had eugenic sterilization laws. The Chinese Exclusion Act, right? An entire statute that was created to keep Chinese women essentially from being able to emigrate to the United States, because the fear was if they came here and then had children with Chinese men who were here to work on the railroads, that then we would have all of these Chinese American children, and that's the last thing that we would want in this country. Anti-miscegenation laws, right, which didn't end in this country until 1967 with the case of Loving versus Virginia. And those laws existed in 40 states before they were struck down by the Supreme Court. And again, to be very clear, anti-miscegenation laws were laws that specifically said people of color could not marry white people. So if you were Indian American and you wanted to marry somebody who was Black, that was perfectly fine. If you were Mexican and you wanted to marry somebody who was Chinese, that was perfectly fine. But none of those people could marry white people. So these laws were very much centered on the idea of white supremacy and supporting white supremacy. And so I say all of that just to be very clear that nothing that happens in this country is sui generis, right? None of it is just coming out of nowhere. We've never seen it before. And what are we supposed to do with it? It all takes place against this very significant backdrop of what has come before. And a lot of what has come before has been deeply problematic. It's been racist, it's been classist, it's been gendered, especially in the realm of procreation and parenting. And I really want to illustrate that point with a story, because I think stories are just incredibly powerful. So here's a story that I want to tell you. I want to tell you a story about the Ralph sisters. This is a picture of the two of them, Mary Alice and Minnie. They had an older sister named Katie, and they were all living with their parents in public housing in Montgomery, Alabama in 1973, the same year Roe versus Wade was decided. Mary Alice and Minnie, the two youngest girls, were both developmentally disabled. This family, like a lot of poor Black families in Alabama and across the South at that time, was receiving services from the Family Planning Clinic of the Montgomery Community Action Committee, which was ultimately funded by the federal government. And for many of these folks, again, poor Black folks in the South, representatives of these agencies were deeply involved in decisions about reproductive health care for the Ralph sisters, all three of the Ralph sisters. So in 1971, they started giving experimental birth control injections to Katie, who was the eldest child. This was the beginning of Depo-Provera. And not too long after, the younger girls also began receiving those shots. Then in 1973, an employee from the CAC brought Katie, the oldest girl, to a physician to have an IUD inserted, even though neither Katie nor her parents had asked for an IUD. Then later in 1973, a nurse arrived at the Ralph home. She picked up Mrs. Ralph and her two youngest daughters, Minnie and Mary Alice, who at that time were 14 and 12, and took them to a local hospital. At the hospital, a nurse asked Mrs. Ralph to sign a consent form, although Mrs. Ralph actually could not read or write, and she believed that she was consenting to the birth control shots that the girls were already getting, and so she signed an X on the consent form. She was told to leave the girls at the hospital, which she did. The next morning, doctors administered general anesthesia to Minnie and Mary Alice, and they surgically sterilized both girls, despite the lack of informed consent from their parents, despite any information that would suggest that they were sexually active, and despite not having any conversation with the girls about what was about to happen to them. Now, this kind of abusive use of sterilization against two poor, developmentally disabled Black girls in this case did not exist in isolation, right? It was part of a far-reaching pattern of sterilizations conducted in public hospitals or by healthcare providers who were otherwise receiving federal assistance. And it wasn't just on Black girls and women in the South, but also Chicanas in California, Puerto Rican women in Puerto Rico, and Indigenous women who received care through the Indian Health Service. Fannie Lou Hamer, the civil rights activist, actually referred to these kinds of sterilizations, especially those that targeted poor Black women in the South, as Mississippi appendectomies, which was a reflection of the fact that women would go in. Sometimes it was to deliver a child, sometimes it was to have some other procedure. And while they were there, some doctor or nurse would decide this is a good time to sterilize this person. Sometimes people didn't even know what had happened until they tried to become pregnant and were told, actually, someone sterilized you at some point in your lifetime. The Southern Poverty Law Center eventually filed a suit against the federal government on behalf of the Ralph sisters and other similarly situated women and girls. And that lawsuit culminated in a settlement, which led to a change in practice and new regulations to clarify that sterilizations could only be performed on people who were competent to consent and only after an appropriate informed consent process. The fact that we had to create regulations for that says something about our healthcare system. And the creation of those procedural safeguards obviously was critical, but sadly remains the case that sterilization practices, especially when it comes to poor women, women of color, women who are incarcerated, are not always neutral. Now, I wanted to start with the Rel story because it's so important, I think, in this space to take note of the ways in which reproductive oppression and reproductive hierarchies have these deep intersectional implications. So for the Rel sisters, it was a combination, right? It was that they were Black, they were poor, they were developmentally disabled. All of those things led to their unconsented sterilization, not just one thing standing alone. And that story, and the stories of so many others like them, actually really calls to mind the larger history, right? Going even further back, the larger history of even obstetrics and gynecology in this country, which starts with Dr. J. Marion Sims, who is the so-called father of gynecology, who performed horrific experiments on enslaved women that led to a lot of the types of gynecological care that we have access to today. So unfortunately, and I'm going to say this as the daughter of a doctor and a nurse, some of the worst forms of reproductive coercion and oppression in this country were supported by, if not initiated, by healthcare providers. And many of the women who found themselves arrested and prosecuted for bad pregnancy outcomes in this country, and I'll talk about that as we go on today, are brought to the attention of law enforcement by healthcare providers. And so what this means is that healthcare providers often become arms of the state for implementing policies and practices that can cause significant harm to their patients and contribute to distrust of the larger medical community. Therefore, healthcare providers are a really central part of the conversations that we have, obviously, about reproductive healthcare. And frequently, they will be in the best position to identify problematic practices and rectify them. And as I'll talk about a little later on, too many healthcare providers at this point are being put in positions where they cannot rectify bad practices that they see going on. So in this moment, when Dobbs has radically restructured abortion care by allowing each state to set its own practices, policies, leading to enormous amounts of chaos and confusion, the pressure on healthcare providers, on policymakers, on activists is significant and will continue to grow. So what I want to do now is jump into the core of my skill set, which is talking about the law. So I want to give you a really quick primer on some of the most relevant Supreme Court cases that have to do with parenting and procreation in this country, including, of course, the abortion cases, and then talk about how Dobbs has really changed that landscape in radical ways. So when we talk about the regulation of procreation and parenting in this country, we start with cases like Meyer versus Nebraska and Prince versus Massachusetts, which are cases where the U.S. Supreme Court said that we have a fundamental right to the care, custody, and control of our minor children. Cases like Skinner versus Oklahoma, which was a eugenic statute, involved a eugenic statute in Oklahoma that allowed for certain classes of criminals to be sterilized once they had committed 3 types of crimes. Turned out that was unconstitutional. Griswold versus Connecticut and Eisenstadt versus Baird, the 2 cases that extended our right to access birth control, first for married people and then for single people. And then, of course, Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which created a right to abortion, a federal constitutional right to abortion. So I want to give you a sense of what Roe and Casey did so that what Dobbs did becomes even more clearly problematic. All right, so this picture is a picture of Norma McCorvey. She is the Roe in Roe versus Wade. She grew up in Texas. She was the daughter of a single mom who happened to be an alcoholic. She got into a lot of trouble as a kid. At one point was sent to reform school. She married and got pregnant at 16, ended up getting divorced before that child was born, and then placed that child for adoption. In 1967, she gave up a second child for adoption immediately after giving birth. And then she became pregnant again in 1969. And at that point, she wanted to have an abortion. Texas at that time made abortion illegal unless the pregnant woman's life was in danger. And of course, in order to show that your life was in danger, you had to get some doctors to say that that was the case, which Norma McCorvey was not going to be able to do. So ultimately, she ended up being referred to two feminist lawyers, Linda Coffey and Sarah Weddington, who had actually been looking for a plaintiff to challenge the Texas abortion law. Because she became the plaintiff in that case, McCorvey actually ended up staying pregnant, gave birth to that child, and that child also was placed for adoption. So the Roe trimester framework is the most protection that we have ever had in this country for access to abortion, at least constitutional protection that came from the Supreme Court. So Roe said a lot of important things. First, it said that there is a fundamental right to abortion that can be found in the Constitution. It said that a fetus is not a constitutional person. It said that the state has an interest in potential life, didn't quantify that interest and define what potential life is, just said there is such an interest. At the court, of course, as I said, didn't define it. And then they created the trimester framework. And the trimester framework, of course, was mapped on to the trimesters of pregnancy. In the first trimester, basically states couldn't regulate, right? The Supreme Court said it's really none of your business. Go sit somewhere until the second trimester comes around. Second trimester, states could regulate, but they could regulate only to protect the health of the person who was pregnant. And then the third trimester, because the state interest was so important at that point, that the state could go so far as to ban abortion, but any abortion ban had to have an exception for the life or health of the pregnant woman. Otherwise, it was unconstitutional. So Roe is where we sat basically until 1992. And there were some interim cases that decided things like Medicaid didn't have to pay for abortions for poor women, cases that decided things that like a state could decide that only physicians can perform abortions, even though other healthcare providers can very safely perform abortions. So some of those things were already happening. And then we came to Casey in 1992. And Casey was a case that came out of Pennsylvania, actually right over the bridge from me. I live about 10 minutes from Philadelphia. And Casey was a case that involved the Pennsylvania Abortion Control Act, which had a whole bunch of different pieces to it, including a spousal notification requirement, a waiting period, biased informed consent, a bunch of reporting requirements, all sorts of things. And so what the court said in Casey was, we didn't give enough weight to the state interest in potential life in Roe. So we need to do more of that in Casey. So they said, we're going to uphold the idea that there is a federal constitutional right to abortion, but we're not going to keep the trimester framework because it doesn't allow the state to really effectuate its interest in potential life, particularly because the court said that interest in potential life starts from the moment that a pregnancy begins. And so essentially what the court said in this case was, we're not going to have the trimester framework. Now we're going to shift just to the line of viability, which of course, certainly anybody here who's a healthcare provider, but lots of other folks as well know that viability is not static, right? And that it changes from pregnancy to pregnancy, from fetus to fetus. At the time that Casey was decided, viability was fixed at about 24 weeks. Of course, some babies would survive younger ages of gestation, et cetera. So all of these changes were made, and then it created this new standard for evaluating whether, in fact, a state regulation was constitutional or unconstitutional. So after Casey, the court said, spousal notification and consent, that's not okay, right? A married woman does not have to tell her husband that she's going to terminate a pregnancy, nor does she have to ask for her husband's permission. Thank you, Supreme Court. Other forms of regulation were acceptable under Casey, though. Waiting periods were acceptable. So we ended up in a situation where women might have to wait anywhere from 24 to 72 hours after their first visit to a clinic before they could actually terminate a pregnancy. The idea being that perhaps you didn't understand the choice that you were making, and so you needed a few more days to sit at home and contemplate it. Biased informed consent requirements, so state mandated language that had to be given to women before they were able to consent to an abortion, including language that is scientifically unsound, right? The claim that abortion causes breast cancer, things that actually aren't true. States were requiring healthcare providers to say these things, and parental notification. So states could require minors to inform their parents that they were pregnant and were seeking an abortion. But even with that, you had to have a judicial bypass option. Now, arguably, telling your parents is hard, but also telling some stranger in a black robe in a courthouse why you want to have an abortion and how you got pregnant and try to prove that you're mature enough to have an abortion without telling your parents is also a pretty difficult thing to do if you're a minor. So those were the things that were okay. So if we took Roe and Casey together, here's what we basically got to: that there's a constitutional right to an abortion. A fetus is not a constitutional person. You cannot ban abortion before fetal viability. After fetal viability, you can ban abortion, but you have to have an exception for the life or health of the pregnant person. You cannot require spousal notification or consent, and you can require minors to talk to their parents. So that's what we got. And then we got the 2022 Supreme Court term, which basically was fire and brimstone, which seems appropriate to say that to a group of secular folks. And so essentially what the court did in this term was decide a whole bunch of cases that really upended law in a variety of different spaces. The one that I obviously care about and that we're talking about today is abortion. So Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health. I'm not going to walk through all the opinions in Dobbs. I'm just going to sort of lay out where we landed. Roe and Casey were overruled. There's no constitutional right to abortion because it's not enumerated in the Constitution. The word abortion doesn't appear in the Constitution. It's not deeply rooted in the nation's history and traditions. And stare decisis, right? The idea that once you make a decision, you stand on that decision unless there are very, very good reasons to reverse it. That stare decisis just didn't count, basically, in this set of circumstances. They also say, of course, that the decision is limited to abortion, or I should say Justice Alito, because Justice Thomas did not say this, but that the decision is limited to abortion because other privacy rights do not involve potential life, right? So carving out this very particular space for abortion and how states could regulate abortion. As I said, I'm happy to delve into the other opinions in the Q&A, but I'm going to keep going so we can get to some of the other meaty stuff here. One thing I do want to say, though, is that the argument that, oh, abortion doesn't appear in the Constitution, so therefore we shouldn't think that it's a protected right. Woman doesn't appear in the Constitution. Sex doesn't appear in the Constitution. Contraception, gender, parent, marriage, privacy, family. None of those words appear in the Constitution, and yet we have created all sorts of rights that center around all of those things. So the fallout from Dobbs, oh, child doesn't exist there either. The fallout from Dobbs has been incredibly chaotic. And the people who are paying the highest price for that decision are pregnant people, obviously, but not just pregnant people who are seeking abortions. So let's walk through it. The first thing that I want to make clear is that when you ban abortion or you severely restrict abortion, the consequences of that are not felt evenly across communities. So women of color are disproportionately represented in the people who have abortions in this country. So a ban obviously has a deep impact, particularly on Black women. 75% of people in this country who have abortions are low income. So you are definitely hitting people in that community. And 59% of folks who have abortions in this country already have children at home. So again, the idea that you would send somebody home for 3 days to think about this whole pregnancy and abortion thing is particularly insulting, given that most of these women already have children. So I really want to think about how these decisions don't just hit everybody the same way. So where are we in terms of state law? New York Times and other outlets have been doing this sort of running tally of what's going on with abortion in the country, which has been very helpful for us who do this work, so we don't have to try to keep up with all of it every day. And so what we know now is about 21 states either have bans or restrict abortion earlier in pregnancy than the standards set by Roe and by Casey, right? So Casey said viability. What we see now are states with bans anywhere from 6 weeks to 22 weeks. Some are 15, but all of them would have been unconstitutional under prior cases. The consequence of that has been lots of clinics that are closing. Some people are super excited about that. Some people obviously feel the deep loss of that. Just within the first 100 days after Dobbs was decided, 66 clinics across the country had already closed, including the clinic that was at issue in Dobbs, which happened to be the very last abortion clinic in the state of Mississippi. Those clinic closures then, of course, have put enormous pressure on other states to fill in those gaps, which they have done quite admirably. It's been very impressive, but it's likely unsustainable without an influx of significant resources, including financial resources, but also more facilities and more abortion providers. We've all heard the stories of miscarriage mismanagement as a consequence of the changes to law behind Dobbs. Women, showing up in an emergency room, miscarrying, and the physician saying, go sit in your car until you bleed more, go home until you're sicker. Pretty shocking, and obviously decisions that are very much outside of the standard of care. Those issues have already been issues in a lot of Catholic hospitals, and Catholic hospitals have been taking over a lot of healthcare in this country over the last couple of decades. And their position typically is that as long as there's any fetal cardiac activity, we are not going to do a D&E, we're not going to induce you, we're not going to end this pregnancy, even though it's clear that the pregnancy is going to end. We need to make sure there's no fetal cardiac activity, even if that means you have to get to the point of sepsis. We've got women who are suing to try to clarify the medical exceptions in a lot of these statutes, which are not written by healthcare providers. They're written by people in the state legislature who may or may not have any understanding of pregnancy. It's pretty shocking that people who think you can move an ectopic pregnancy from a fallopian tube into the uterus are making decisions about pregnancy and about abortion. So that has been a very big issue, and we've got litigation going dealing with that. Questions about what access people get to medications and about pharmacists being in positions to refuse to give people abortion medications, even when those medications are being used for something other than abortion, which does happen. We've got the huge lawsuit that is going on right now that has to do with mifepristone, which is one of the medications that is used for medication abortion in this country. The case that we're watching right now is the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine versus the Food and Drug Administration. So there are two medications essentially. There are two medications that are used for medication abortion, mifepristone and misoprostol. The lawsuit that is currently winding its way through the courts and that is going to be decided by the Supreme Court this term is only focused on mifepristone. And essentially what the plaintiffs are trying to do in that case, first they were trying to get the FDA approval of mifepristone basically thrown out. That appears that it's not going to happen. But there have been all these changes in how mifepristone can be used in this country. So the FDA has increased the gestational age, right? So it's now up to 10 weeks. You can still have a medication abortion. They have rolled back the in-person requirements. You can do a medication abortion using telehealth. They've made a lot of changes that have really made medication abortion more accessible. And this is important. One, so first, medication abortion can only happen in the first trimester. 90% of abortions in this country are in the first trimester, and 50% of abortions in this country are medication abortions. So when you make that inaccessible, you really make a very big difference in people's lives. Um, the other thing that we're very worried about is the proliferation of maternity care deserts, meaning places where people do not have access to obstetrical care, to prenatal care, which obviously is a problem, particularly in a country like ours that has the highest maternal mortality rate of any developed nation. And those maternity, oh, see, this is where that slide was. And those maternity deserts are in lots of places around the country. This is from the Martha Dimes report from 2022, and you can see a lot of red on that map. And the expectation is that that map will get even more red for a few reasons. One is that OBGYNs are leaving a lot of states that have bans or severe restrictions on abortion because they cannot do their work the way that they need to, and that's going to create more maternity deserts. And then we also have to be worried about who's even going to be able to do abortions in the future if people can't get training. So if you're going to a medical school in a red state and you want to get training for abortions, that's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for you to do. All of that then means that we should get poised for more dead women. Increased maternal morbidity, increased maternal mortality, especially for Black women who are anywhere from 2 to 5 times more likely to die during pregnancy in this country. And nobody will be shocked to know that maternal mortality rates in states with more abortion restrictions tend to be higher, right? And most of those states are not making changes to try to deal with that reality. The other thing we worry a lot about in this context is criminalization. So finding ways to criminalize women who are suspected of self-managing abortion, women who miscarry, and there are questions about whether it was really a miscarriage or could they have done something different, women who use illicit drugs during their pregnancies. Those are the kinds of things that we have seen in the past, and we can definitely imagine that those things are going to ramp up as we move into the future. And then the last bit that what did I do? Okay. Also concerns about forced sterilization, right? So we're seeing more people asking for permanent forms of sterilization because they fear that they won't be able to get an abortion if they do become pregnant. Concerns about forced obstetrical interventions in order to protect a fetus. We have had these cases in this country. There are multiple forced C-section cases in this country. And the more that we sort of personify the fetus, the more likely it is that we will see more of these cases. So the last piece that I want to talk to you about today, and I see already I'm running very, very low on time, so I'm going to do this quickly, is talking about the personhood movement and the consequences, the significant consequences of deciding that a fetus is a person, right? I said that Rose said that a fetus is not a constitutional person. We seem to be moving away from that, and the Supreme Court seems to have given states some pretty wide latitude in how they think about fetal personhood. And then, of course, embryonic personhood, which we saw in the most recent case that came out of Alabama. And I want to talk about that case here. So that case is called, I don't want you to read that quote yet because it's so outrageous. It's called LePage versus the Center for Reproductive Medicine. It is a case that comes out of Alabama. It involved 3 couples who had done IVF. They all had had children using frozen embryos and still had some embryos that were left and that were being kept in what the Alabama Supreme Court referred to as cryogenic nurseries. And somebody walked into the room, a patient in the hospital walked into the room where these embryos were stored, was able to open one of the containers, take some of the embryos out. Of course, it burned their hand because it was so cold. They dropped it and those embryos were destroyed. That whole story is incredibly specious, but that's the story that we've been given. And these parents sued, making multiple claims. And the claim that's relevant here is a claim under the state's Wrongful Death Act, which was passed in 1872. And the plaintiff sued and basically said, our children were killed and we should be able to recover for the loss of our children. The Alabama Supreme Court, in its opinion, said that embryos are, in fact, unborn children. The analysis in the opinion is some of the wildest stuff I have seen, and I've been looking at these cases for a very long time. But the concurrence that was written by the Chief Justice, that's the piece that I want to read for you all. So this is what the Chief Justice wrote in his concurrence. People of Alabama have declared the public policy of the state to be that human life is sacred. We believe that each human being from the moment of conception is made in the image of God, created by him to reflect his likeness. It is as if the people of Alabama took what was spoken of the prophet Jeremiah and applied it to every unborn person in the state. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you. All three branches of government are subject to a constitutional mandate to treat each unborn human life with reverence, carving out an exception for the people in this case, and by people, he means embryo, small as they were, would be unacceptable to the people of the state who have required us to treat every human being in accordance with the fear of a holy God who made them in his image. As I've been talking to people about this case, I've been saying, reading that opinion was basically like, sitting in a pew in church on a Sunday, right? It's pretty shocking. Not that courts never talk about religion or never talk about God, but this was really crossing a very distinct line. So what flows from these questions of fetal personhood and particularly embryonic personhood? Obviously, limits on the practice of fertility medicine. How many embryos can be created, how many can be transferred into a uterus. You obviously cannot use those embryos for research. You obviously cannot destroy those embryos. Potentially limits on what you can test for. All the embryos that are going to be used for IVF are going to be checked for quality, right? Some embryos are more likely to create a healthy pregnancy, some less so. But often they will also be tested for disease or disability. And parents will say, well, I don't want to use that one. I don't want to use the other one. You can imagine a state that says you get what you get and you don't get upset, right? You have to use all of them. And then finally, the specter of embryo adoption, right? So why would it be the case if embryos are people, if they are unborn children, and the people who created them don't want to use them to bring them to fruition? Why is that any different than dropping off a newborn at a firehouse, right? So if you have abandoned those embryos, and right now there's anywhere from 400,000 to 1 million, right? We don't have a good number, frozen embryos in this country. So imagine the state deciding, let's take those and we're going to find parents for them. And we're going to take those embryos and we're going to give them to other people because they deserve the chance at life. So we're in chaos. There are so many questions that we have to ask, so many questions that aren't going to be answered for quite some time. But in the meantime, I'd like to think that there are things that we can do. We can support women and other pregnant people who are seeking abortion care. You can do that by giving donations. You can do that in a way that I do, which is working with a practical support network. Literally, for some people, it's having somebody who's willing to pick them up from their house and drive them to the clinic. That's the difference between having an abortion and not having abortion. We can push our legislatures to do the right thing in all the very ways that exists. So it's not enough if you ban abortion, well, then let's look at our social safety net. Have you extended Medicare to make sure that women who have babies have access to postnatal care for a full year instead of for a few weeks? Are you making sure that you don't have kids who are going to school hungry? Are you making sure that everybody has access to adequate housing? The answer to those questions, by the way, is no. But those are the things certainly that they should be doing. We should think beyond abortion, right? We should think about what's going to happen to contraception. We should think about what is going on in our child welfare system. We should think about our educational system. All of those things matter. And then obviously in this context, we also need to think about how quickly the line between faith of some individuals is being erased and forcing all of us to live other people's faith, which is not exactly what our Constitution seems to be requiring. So as we think about what the next steps are, and frankly prepare for more Supreme Court foolishness because it's coming, I hope that you'll all recognize that Dobbs matters not just because of its present impact, but because it's part of this much larger history and present of procreation and parenting being sites of systemic oppression in this country, particularly against marginalized people and particularly against women. I believe, because I have to, or I wouldn't do this work, that we can do better. But that requires work from a lot of different people, including all of us who are having this conversation today. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to the rest of our conversation.
Wow. Is just like wow, that's all I can say. The one of the last things you said was, you're giving us avenues to be able to, create the kind of change that we want to see. And one of the things that you said was push your state legislatures. And I just have to give a big old shout out here to Senator Priya Sundaresan and Representative Stephanie Stahl Hamilton here in our legislature. And I don't know, Kimberly, if you've heard this, because I know it did make national news. But so Governor Katie Hobbs, along with these two women and a bunch, the Democratic caucus, were like, we need to ensure access to contraception. Had a press conference. I think this was like Thursday or Friday of last week, and then and then Senator Sonny Borelli, who loves the sound of his own voice and who himself, he wears pinky rings. I'm just saying. And also he has multiple, charges and investigations of domestic violence abuse, right? Like, so we know that this guy, exactly what he thinks of women and even those in his life. And he said, nobody's trying to take away your contraception, ladies. Bear aspirin, or Bear invented aspirin. Put one between your knees, and there's your birth control. Well, I found out that he canceled all of his meetings and everything for the rest of the day. And then like Huffington Post and all these people picked it up. I mean, like, he's the Senate Majority Leader in Arizona. So we are definitely pushing them. And an even more brilliant move, because the only thing that the Democrats in this state can do, because the Republicans have been in charge essentially since the 1960s, they
Mm,
look at that rules book, right? Because they will be
mm,
cut out. Less than 1% of the bills that Democrats put out in the state of Arizona even get a hearing. So they
wow.
looked at that rules book and they figured a workaround to be able to push those bills onto the floor earlier this week, Tuesday or Wednesday. It was glorious. It was beautiful. And poor Stahl Hamilton, who, by the way, is going to be one of the speakers at our secular summit coming up April 11th, so you won't want to miss that. But she was told that she could not use the words birth control or any, like, she couldn't use contraception, birth control, like all these words that she had to avoid. And still, it was glorious. They forced the vote, and right there on the big screen in both chambers, you could see who voted against, women
Mm,
having access to birth control. And it was
hmm.
right down party lines. So don't tell me that you're not coming for our birth control when you very
Yeah,
clearly will not support our access to birth control. That's it.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
and
Absolutely. And I'll say in that same vein, um, part of the playbook is also expanding what is birth control, right? What is contraception? So Students for Life in particular has worked really hard, so much so that the FDA had to change the labeling on emergency contraception, on Plan B, to say that it does not keep a fertilized egg from implanting, right? Because they were making the argument, Students for Life is making the argument that that's just an abortion, right? No, it's not. It's a form of contraception. So, yeah, there's a war on science as well as wars on lots of other things going on as well.
you mentioned something, really about how these, just move your ectopic pregnancy to your uterus, no big deal. Like, it is embarrassing. Or, there was some famous footage too about a guy not understanding that that we have several openings, you know,
Yeah,
and he didn't realize that it wasn't a shared opening. I mean, like,
yeah, yeah.
you
It's
mentioned
it's
something.
disturbing.
You mentioned something too about, cardiac activity. And
Hmm.
like, we also know, like, that cardiac activity that they talk about, like, it's just the movement of the cells. Like, could you maybe speak about that a little bit and how that has been, like, first of all, the denial of experts to be able to do their job, so much so that they are closing their practices and leaving states, is absolutely bonkers to me. But can you talk a little bit about that whole cardiac activity thing and how they've stuck a pin in that?
Yeah. So there's sort of multiple ways that cardiac activity comes into play, right? So first we've got the folks, like Texas and Georgia with 6-week bans, right? Or actually Texas just bans. And they say that 6 weeks is by that time, a fetus has basically a beating heart, which is literally laughable, right? And so that's the first piece of it, right? So it's these what they call heartbeat bills, which is also, I think, part of this larger attempt to continue to keep people super confused about how pregnancy works. And the example that I love to use for that, I'll go back to cardiac activity because there's more to talk about there, but the example I love to use for that, I'm sure you see these billboards down where you guys are, but certainly they are up here, even in New Jersey, the big billboard, and they'll have like a 6-month-old, right? And say something like, abortion stops a beating heart or something like that. Nobody's having an abortion with a 6-month-old, right? That is not what a fetus looks like. That is not what a fetus at 6 weeks gestation looks like. But it's a way to really confuse people and to make people, engage with this conversation in a different way. So you have the cardiac activity stuff at 6 weeks, but then even later in pregnancy, right? So when someone's miscarrying at 20, 21, 22 weeks, what Catholic hospitals have been saying for a long time, but what some other hospitals now are finding themselves saying is, look, we know that you are losing this pregnancy, right? Your cervix is opening, you've lost your amniotic fluid. This is not a pregnancy that is going to sustain itself. But we can still find that little bit of fetal cardiac activity. And as long as that is in existence, we will not provide an abortion for you. We need you to get sicker, in order for us to do that, because we don't know what the state is going to do. Are they going to kind of arrest us? Are they going to shut down our hospital? And so what a lot of these physicians are saying is, I'm basically being told not to provide the standard of care to my patients, right? Something that we would have done routinely before Dobbs happened, because we wouldn't have been checking even, right, for fetal cardiac activity, because we know this is a lost pregnancy. Now they're saying, go home, come back when you're not well. And that's such an awful thing to do to a person who is losing a pregnancy. And yet that's what some of these hospitals are finding themselves doing.
Yeah, and you said I love this quote that they want us to be confused about how pregnancy works. And these bans, these abortion bans, these birth control bans, now suddenly embryos have more rights than I do.
Mm-hmm.
These are the same states that'll say abstinence only birth,
Yeah.
sex education, despite the fact that every study shows that it keeps our kids safer.
Mm-hmm.
My background is in education, and I was on a board where in 2014 we adopted comprehensive sex ed, and the outcomes over the last 10 years have been amazing for that district.
That's
And
right.
so I just cannot help but, like, there's a connection here. Like, there is a connection here where clearly there's half of the population, at least those who subscribe to this white Christian nationalist ideology, clearly want the other half of the population to be subjugated and to be
Yep.
confined.
Yep.
And then to have other women, working, like, the Boberts of the world and the Marjorie
Mm-hmm.
Taylor Greens. I'm just grateful here that in 2022, we made some good decisions, and we are a nonpartisan organization. I'll say it again forever and ever. But thank goodness for Chris Mays, who is now promising that she is going to come after these crisis pregnancies
Mm-hmm.
so I know we don't have a lot of time, but I could talk to you, I think, all day. And I wish that you could just sit in our reproductive justice coalition that we have on Friday mornings. And like, I've been texting people, oh my gosh, you have to see, but they already know, they already know who you are. But I'd love for you to talk real quick about CPCs, those crisis pregnancy centers.
Yeah. So crisis pregnancy centers are also about confusing people, right? They often set up near clinics. They sort of pretend that they are offering healthcare, right? So they will often do ultrasounds and they will do pregnancy tests, even if the people there are not actually qualified to do ultrasounds. So there have been some really horrible stories about, not cleaning equipment between patients, just things that are really problematic. And they basically try to convince the people who come into them not to have abortions, right? And they claim they're going to offer all these services to you, and we're gonna help you. Although there isn't good data to suggest that there is a lot of help that people are given after they have gone to a crisis pregnancy center. So I think that the really big issue with crisis pregnancy centers right now, one, is that in states where abortion clinics have closed, they really are going to fool people because people think this is the only thing that's open, right, in the state, and these people are going to help me. And two, that there are many states that continue to give these crisis pregnancy centers huge amounts of money that should be going for comprehensive sex education, for access to contraception, for prenatal care, for postnatal care, all of these things. And instead it's being used in this very not helpful way. So you see some places like California really going after CPCs, and other places that are really leaning into them now because they feel like, all right, nobody gets to have an abortion here. So we're going to give all this money to CBCs, and they're going to provide all these services to people who are going to end up having babies that they didn't want in the first instance. The other thing that I'll say that also comes out of CPCs and often comes out of the anti-choice movement in general, is this claim, that the answer to abortion is adoption, right? And if you don't want to have a baby, that, obviously you can just, give your baby up, you can place your baby for adoption, which one ignores just a basic fact of research, which is that very few women who are denied abortions will put that child up for adoption. That's just not the way most people are going to respond to being forced to remain pregnant. If you do decide to place a child for adoption, it really depends on whether that child is going to be popular, right, in our system. And so part of the thought process is, am I going to place a child for adoption who ends up, languishing in foster care for years, or is this child going to find a family? So adoption is not the answer either. And that is something that CPCs push a lot.
And this is a quick aside because I have another question that I really want to get to, and I know you're limited on time. But oh shoot, I forgot it. So that's fine. It doesn't matter what the question is. Okay, so lawsuits. Can we expect, like the AMA or the Obstetrics and Gynecological Organization, whatever they are, or like you mentioned the Hippocratic, like, can we expect lawsuits? Because like I used to be a teacher and I loved it. And I can't teach in Arizona anymore because they've made it untenable. Like, can't they sue people for making their job so completely untenable and actually violating their Hippocratic oath? Is there movement in that direction?
There isn't really a lot of movement in that direction. So most of the litigation that we're seeing is litigation that has plaintiffs who are women who were, denied abortions, whose miscarriages were mismanaged. Those are the ones that we're seeing so far. And so the strategy coming out of a lot of the movement lawyers is, make the exceptions work, and then we'll sort of move on to trying to get rid of the bans. And you don't really need doctors as plaintiffs for those. And I think it's much harder for doctors, right? Because it's much harder to say, I used to be able to practice medicine in a certain way, and now I can't practice medicine in that way. And so I have been harmed. Although I will say one of the things that is, if you look at the case Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine versus the FDA, the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine is a bunch of, anti-choice physicians and healthcare providers. And, their claim is that they have a right to sue over mifepristone because their doctors, and they might be in an emergency room one day where a woman comes in who's had a bad outcome from medication abortion, and they would be forced to provide care to her, which is ridiculous on so many levels, right? So first of all, medication abortion is really one of the safest things that you can do. Two, if you do end up with complications and you go to a hospital, you provide care, right? No matter how somebody ends up in your hospital, you're going to be obliged to provide care to that person, right? So if they're having a miscarriage, whatever it is, whether it's because of a self-managed abortion or not, you're still going to be required to provide care to that person. So, we're seeing judges in some of these cases, some of them appointed by Trump, who are just making decisions that are completely just out of the stratosphere in terms of how they're thinking about law. And, that's not something that I said in my talk, but I think one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of the issues that we're talking about start in abortion, but have really large implications, right? So if the Supreme Court decides that, the FDA doesn't have expertise on drug approval, then maybe the DOJ doesn't have expertise on what cases they should be bringing, and maybe the EPA doesn't have expertise on environmental regulation. I mean, so many things potentially can fall as a consequence of what's being done in the area of abortion, which is terrifying.
Well, this has been another delightful discussion of falling into fascism Fridays. Maybe that's what I'll
Yeah.
be calling them.
Well,
And
I'll say something positive. I will say
Excellent.
something positive.
Good.
So one, I feel very lucky that I get to work with young future lawyers, people who are deeply committed to a better world than the world that we live in now. And that always makes me really happy. And two, I think that a lot of people have woken up, right? People who were feeling very sort of settled, and young people who couldn't have imagined that Roe would be overturned, and who are suddenly like, wait a minute, I should be voting more, right? I should be doing these things more. So, and we have seen in states that you're surprised by, Michigan, Kentucky, right? States where once people get an opportunity to vote on abortion, they vote to protect access to abortion. So, I do feel like the folks who are opposed to it, the folks who are sort of forcing their faith onto the rest of us, are getting rocked back on their heels a little bit, and that's a good thing.
Ah, there it is. There's the hope. See, okay, falling into fashion Fridays aren't always bad. And here in Arizona, we do have the abortion access for all petitions that are wildly successful. In fact, I'm hearing about all of these like incel kind of Adolf Hitler lookalike people showing up and trying to, deter people from signing. And all it is doing, it's lovely. All it's doing is enraging people to rush over to sign those petitions. So,
Awesome.
gosh, oh my gosh, Kimberly Mutcherson, somebody in the chat gave you a standing ovation. Thank you so much for the work that you do. This, I say this all the time, but this was one of my favorite Friday discussions.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always fun for me to do these things, and I like to talk to folks who are also trying to build a better world.
Oh, and you know what? If you have any law students who need an internship, please let us know.
I will definitely. Happy to
All
do
right,
it.
all right, Kimberly, and everybody else, have a wonderful weekend, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.
Everybody.
Bye.